screen now.
Well, good.
Excellent. So we'll get going. Welcome to this session of the RDA Data Usage Metrics Working Group. This is possibly the last session of the Data Usage Metrics Working Group. And on behalf of Daniela and myself, I'd like to welcome you. Daniela's been posting in the chat a link through to our collaborative notes document. There's a tiny URL on the screen for that. If you'd like to go there, indicate that you are here, add any other notes that you want to as we go through this. Our agenda for today is to give a recap of group activities. And if any of you were present at the last virtual session we did, which was nominally in Costa Rica, you will see some similarities, but we're going through that. So if there's anyone new to this, that will have a sense of what the group has been doing. We'll then get an update from Martin Fenner, who'll be talking about make data count and data usage standardization. And then what we want to do is walk through the draft final recommendation that we put out there for comment, have discussion around that, but then move on to sort of discussion for how data usage metrics might continue to be a topic within RDA, if indeed it should. So to begin at the very beginning, this group was conceived in a meeting room in Berlin. And if we just focus on the recommendation at the heart here, I think the core part of this was to build a recommendation for community guidance on data usage metrics. But at that point, we thought it was important to be able to sort of think about what the scope would be. So what are the types of data that would be addressing? What might the use cases to be? And also sort of mindful that there's possibly an outreach piece to this. So the question that then follows is, what did we actually do? Like any good working group, the first thing we did was undertake a survey. And this was aimed to sort of get a feeling for how repositories around the world were currently approaching the topic of data usage metrics, whether they are actually generating them, using them, publishing them. And so with input from Thomas Juno, we ran this survey during February and March of 2019. We got, I forget where the number is, but we got quite a good sort of level of response from 85 responses, from more than half of which were for domain-specific repositories, but a good showing of institutional repositories. Probably very much skewed. In fact, 80% of it was skewed towards Europe and North America. What this survey told us that was 89% of the respondents were in fact tracking data downloads, and 66% were tracking metadata views and downloads. And about half of these people were receiving requests for these metrics. So it's something that people were sort of already thinking about and tackling. We observed as well that when it came to requests from metrics, probably it was institutional repositories who were primarily receiving these more so than perhaps the domain repositories. So downloads and views were being tracked by many, but they weren't necessarily being exposed. We also asked about other potential sort of metrics that you could use for maybe measuring data usage, such as whether data sets are being cited or the sort of volume downloads, and those weren't being tracked as much. When it came to sort of like some sort of kind of implementation of sort of public data usage metrics, about a third of respondents were considering that implementation, but not actually going forward with it. And there was a lot of sort of comments that suggested that sort of lack of time and resources was the most common reason for not actually exposing these. Some doubt maybe as to sort of the value of doing so. And finally, there was sort of, we asked questions around what methods people were using for this, and there was a combination of off-the-shelf and bespoke methods. Interestingly, Google Analytics came up as a way of people tracking things, and that's quite interesting because if anyone's sort of dug into Google Analytics, depending on the volume of your measures, it's only going to give you a representative sample, not necessarily accurate measures. We also asked questions around the counter code of compliance, which has there's a compliance which has recently at the time, in any case, had been published sort of like this code of practice for properly measuring data set downloads and views that people might be able to adopt. And this is something that we sort of track throughout the lifetime of this working group, of providing updates on that project to sort of like encourage and probe adoption of this. And Martin may or may not be saying more about this, I don't know, but certainly in terms of tools that have been developed to sort of like that sit alongside this. Well, a particular question we asked was, what do the barriers you see to sort of actually adopting this? And primarily it comes down to that time and tools and staff being available to actually do this. And I think it's, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because all those things could be overcome if an organization wanted to. So I don't think it's just lack of time. I guess it says something about where people perhaps feel this is on their overall priority list. In Botswana in 2018, a focus of the meeting there was to look at some of the potential pitfalls that might arise as a result of data usage metrics, particularly if you're just basing it on downloads and views. And the example used there was sort of some observations that we'd made at the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre around use of crystal structure data. This is just one example of sort of one of the sort of issues that we sort of posed, is that when we look at some of our usage metrics, it can be very much influenced by our social media activity. And so the question is that meaningful from the point of view of reflecting some kind of intrinsic value of a particular data set? Other sorts of issues that came up were whether, you know, where data sets might get featured in educational material, if your system presents results in an arbitrary fashion and it's always the same sort of like entries that are at the top when there might be other ones useful further down, but the top ones answer the question, and you get it answering the question you answered, answering the question you posed, are you getting skewed results? Mindful of usage behind firewalls, particularly sort of like in industry. It's not unknown for industry to download open data resources, use them behind their firewalls. And, you know, measuring views and downloads isn't necessarily going to sort of like track that, which could be quite impactful usage. And yeah, I think this is the important thing, is that, you know, if we're going to measure views and downloads, what does it tell us about, you know, the value of a data set? Do you risk undermining the sort of value of having a comprehensive corpus, derived knowledge? And there was also discussion around what is the distinction between a view and a download, because you can do a lot by viewing data sets in some contexts in a web browser. But, you know, we didn't want this to be sort of like a sort of complete downer on the idea of counting things, measuring, reporting them. And so in Helsinki, we had a presentation from Tobias Weber, who sort of took these issues and started to look at them proactively as to how one might be able to sort of like come up with ways of reflecting some of those concerns, but still presenting back usage metrics that were meaningful and useful. And there's a link there to Tobias's sort of summary page, and also to the presentation he gave in Helsinki. Now, if this was an ideal world, we'd be coming to you saying, not only have we come up with recommendations, but we've come up with a load of solutions to these research questions. But that's not the way it's played out. And I think, yeah, this potentially points to further work that's necessary down the line. So at the last RDA plenary, the sort of key focus of that session that we had there was to get community comments on the key messages that we felt had emerged from the past discussions that we had, to feed into the recommendations that we were going to draft. This is very pithily summarized as there's interest, it's complicated, there seems to be a bit of an activation energy barrier to people actually addressing this. We need to be cautious. Normalization is important. We need to understand the shortcomings, and perhaps a sense that the conversation should continue. So since that plenary, and credit primarily falls here to Daniela for pulling together these sort of like all the sort of input that we've received across the sort of various plenaries where we've had these discussions, to come up with a set of recommendations that have been out on the RDA website for review. The DOI is for those is there, and I will paste it into the chat so that if you haven't had a chance to take a glance, that you can do. And then later on in this session, Daniela is going to walk us through those recommendations and see what comments people have. So that's the overview. We're going to move on now to have an update from Martin, but I guess just before we do, have there been any comments or questions in the chat that we want to address now?
No questions, Ian. So I think we can move on to Martin.
Okay.
Seeing my first slide. Okay, I take it with the visual feedback you do. I will spend the next 10 minutes to talk about the Make Data Count project, which is a grant-funded activity that involves several organizations. The lead is Daniela, and from California Digital Library, data site, which I'm representing, is also involved, and we closely collaborate with the Bibliometrics group in Ottawa, led by Stephanie Haustein, which technically is a separate grant. And you heard her present in this colleagues session yesterday, because I know there's some overlap between who is attending data usage sessions at RDA. What I want to do is talk about one part of the MDC grant, and it might be confusing because this is sort of the third iteration of MDC. We got grant funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation last year for 2 years of work, where half of the work is about usage stats. And it's here, and because of the pandemic, things have started slowly. So we are still at a fairly early stage, but I think it's interesting to talk about what we have done so far, what we want to do, and I think it aligns well with the challenges with data usage. I would say, I mean, there are other problems to solve with data usage, but one fundamental problem is adoption. Data usage of not something that is commonly done. Organizations are interested in. We heard more than once that would like to, but it's quite a hurdle as far as the resourcing goes. You also see that slide, just to make sure, because I don't see my slide in the screen here. Okay.
Okay.
So adoption is not the only problem to solve, but if we don't solve that, then data usage will never take off. And like everything else, without a critical mass, it doesn't really become useful. Just that some repository that has the technical resources and is large enough to do that, that's fine for them. That does not necessarily a small organization where the resourcing is more limited. And that's why the focus in the MDC grant to sort of work on usage is about how can we increase adoption. And what I want to do is to look at the number of adoption challenges and talk about how we want to address them in this project. I have to see how I manage this with my screen. So I picked 4 challenges, and I realized just before the start of the session, I'm missing one important one, which is standards that make it easy to compare user stats from different repositories. And that's the counter code of practice that exists. And while it's not perfect, and I'm partly to blame because I'm a co-author, that's the best thing we have that allows us to sort of provide comparable usage metrics across data repositories. So that should be one challenge in here because it's quite detailed. It is also guidance that makes life easier, but it can also be painful at points. But you could also say this is one more reason that user stats should either be provided as a hosted solution by a smaller number of organizations, and that then sort of these kinds of things are sort of taken away from the repository. I wrote in the grant that we felt that's the most important thing we can do, provide a hosted solution to user stats. The first topic that comes up there when the solution means somewhere physically else is processing your usage. I'm not sure whether that makes it any better. And that brings up a big challenge of privacy, because user stats are related to cookies, to IP addresses, etc., and that's sort of privacy that you don't want to expose. And I make this very short because that is the topic for discussion. I think you should not conflate user stats with any other sort of discovery that you want to do about your users. It just creates a mess. And it's particularly important in some countries. I live in Germany, that's certainly one of those places, and European Union, GDPR in general. And I just suggest for user stats, it's not needed to know that this user has visited you 3 weeks before. That's not in any sort of an account code of practice, that's nowhere in there. So just don't use any that has any issues with privacy. That's sort of one challenge, and I will come to sort of popular tools in a second. The second conclusion we have drawn is, or the third one after the hosting, log files. Processing log files is one common way to generate user stats, but it's super, super painful. And I think everybody would agree. And if we can do without, that would make our life much, much easier. And the last one is simply open source, which is sort of, well, one of the main reason why using Google Analytics doesn't work for user stats, because it's a closed solution where we cannot tweak this in any way to sort of follow the counter code of practice for research data. That makes it impossible. Analytics, where sort of a good example is just slightly why you do this and what you want to collect. And if the tool you're using, you will not get to something that makes it comparable to other data repositories. In this slide, I look at 4 common approaches to data usage, which is you do a log processing for yourself, written in your scripting language of choice, like Python, for example, or there is no tool that is sort of everybody's using right now. There's sort of a number of individual solutions. Then there's the 2 popular web analytics tools, of course, Google Analytics, but also Matomo, used to be called Kivik, that have been around forever. And then there is something that you might not heard of that's called Plausible, which is another open source solution. And the tools are listed taken from the sort of challenges I mentioned in the previous slide. Matomo says maybe in most categories because you can do both. You can do with log files and you can do without log files. You can do privacy sort of very strict or more lax. You can run this yourself on your own service, or you can pay somebody in a hosted service. And what we have decided for MVC is we need to use open source and building something from scratch. We use one of the existing open tools that provide 60–70% of the functionality we need. We don't use log files, and that means tracker that's embedded on the page, which is what Google Analytics is doing, which is what Matomo can do, which is what Plausible can do. And we also follow the success of Aggregation, which is a service for all UK institutional repositories to track their user. That's going on for many years, and basically I think about 100 institutions in the UK are participating. So that's aside from web, that's sort of a proof that this totally works, and that's any log files. And what we also decided, and I think this is a sort of very much ongoing discussion with personally identifying information, that we just don't want to have anything to do with that. It's not needed for usage stats. The only thing is needed that we want to distinguish between unique and total visitors. So if somebody comes back 30 minutes later, we want to say that's the same person, but if that person comes back to the same landing page 3 weeks later, we don't really care, because that's not something that the counter standard wants to know. If you then boil it down to sort of the open source platforms that exist, then there's Matomo and Plausible, and I'm happy to hear from OpenAir what their logic was. Those, of course, widely used, super flexible, uses technologies that are not crazy or complicated. Because that sounds too easy, we decided to use Plausible, which is a fairly new open source used in production. So you can both subscribe to a service or just download the open source version. And it is very well aligned with the technology for what makes sense for usage stats, for using a time series database and using a language and a web framework that is really can handle sort of lots of requests of this kind of information well. And the functionality is really focused. So there's far fewer things we can do with Plausible compared to Matomo, but that's the things we care about, and that makes it much easier to tweak to the usage stats use cases. And this is just a screenshot just showing that we have started tracking usage. We are using Dryad as a pilot partner to sort of build out the service, because we, after setting this up to track landing page reads, we obviously have to do a lot of tweaks to sort of follow the code of practice for research data. And that's sort of the work. And that's on the next slide. After we have done the initial setup, until the end of the year, we will work on sort of adjusting the processing of users data to follow the counter code of practice. At the second half of the work, once we are sort of collecting usage in a standardized way that makes it comparable, to generate reports using the sushi format that can be shared with other organizations, and again in a standardized format. Which brings us into, at some point next year, where this is sort of mature enough that we can offer this as a service to the laboratories. So you can now know that this is coming, or maybe you already knew that, but it's a little bit longer until this is sort of open for business, because there's sort of a focus, that's my last slide, on development work this year. But we look forward to sort of bringing this to a stage where data repositories can participate, and I hope that that this is really focused on making adoption of user stats for data repositories much easier than it's now. It's basically after this initial system is tweaked, including a JavaScript token on your landing pages, and that's all you have to do on the technical work, and you have sort of real access to your user stats. So it's sort of real stats with a sort of web analytics built in. So there are some things that you get for free, which means that it's sort of immediate user data, not only at the end of the month when we have processed your sort of your log files, And it also includes referrer information where people are coming from, which is not typically part of usage stats. And with that, thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Martin. It looks like you have one question in the Q&A, but if folks can add their questions either in Q&A or chat. It looks like the first question is from Raymond, and he says, with your platform, is it possible to download data outside of a landing page? That is, can users download files directly with URLs, e.g. via script? If so, can you track that with your approach?
I think that's a very good question, because this really pinpoints to one issue that's difficult with this approach. If you use a JavaScript tracker and you have sort of auto machine to automate downloads, it's possible this bypasses JavaScript because it's just using JavaScript. So
Martin, I think we lost your audio. Maybe you want to stop sharing the screen and that'll help.
It looks like he froze. So let me see.
Can someone reboot, Mark?
it has sort of
Martin, there you are.
on top of Matomo, and Iris is.
Martin, I'm going to cut you off. We didn't get your answer. Can you stop sharing your screen? And that might help with this connection. We weren't really able to hear the answer to the first question.
Okay, so should I try again, or should I type it in?
Try again now with the answer to the Raymond's question, and then we'll move on from there.
Okay, so the short answer is we have to tweak that if your script automatically downloading is not using JavaScript in any way. This is tricky with trackers, but there are some tweaks we can do. So the final answer I can only give you in a few months.
The second question, Martin, was you mentioned Iris and OpenAir. Can you talk about how the Envision service compares?
Well, I'm not sure whether somebody from OpenAir is on the call. I think I saw Paolo earlier, so that might be easier. Have them talk. Iris is different because it focuses on institutional repositories and text documents, which means it uses a different code of practice, not for research data, but counter release 5. But the general approach of using a tracker and a sort of centralized service to collect the usage, that's sort of conceptually, that's implementation is different, and also is a little bit older now, meaning that there are lessons learned. Comparative study between Matomo and Plausible does not exist as far as I know. Plausible launched about a year ago as a sort of paid for service. It's a small Lithuanian, I don't know how you, let's say startup, but they are very much in a sort of in the open sense, where their main argument is privacy. And sort of the issue with using JavaScript trackers to track machine usage might be tricky, but from the experience from the previous MDC project, that's the trade-off I'm willing to do, because it's all about adoption. Then sort of the most important thing is to track the usage data from humans, and we can see how much we can get also the machines tracked, and machines sort of the good machines, if you will, not the bots and spiders, but the sort of automated Python scripts that researchers use to download data.
Paolo, do you want to unmute and read your question if it's longer? Or if you're not there, Martin, do you want to address that?
Yeah, we had a little discussion about this yesterday, and I totally see Paolo, and also Ian mentioned that views and downloads is an oversimplified view of the world, which already falls apart for Ian's repository, where you show crystal structures. So when you see it rendered as in the screen, is it a view, is it a download, or? But for me, the driver of everything is adoption, and for the foreseeable future, views and downloads is something that people understand and that we have to support. I can totally see that in a few years we track very different things, but if we don't have this available, views and downloads, I think we cannot move forward.
Any other questions for Martin? Oh, last one from Marie. What about data citation counts in publications?
Oh, for me, that's a different beast. I mean, a different kind of metric that there's lots of people sort of thinking about how to do this better, but I wouldn't mix it with usage. For me, that's something else. Just like there's also other metrics that are neither usage nor citations.
All right, if people have other questions for Martin, we can put them in the chat. Oh, okay, last question from Paolo. The question is exactly, can we extend? Is the framework flexible in this respect?
If you have some experience with Matomo or web analytics in general, Plausible is very similar. That built in, you have the views, and even downloads, you have to do some extra work because you have to identify what's the download link on the page, etc. So, okay. And that goes for other things as well, that you can expand over time. So because it's JavaScript, you can track interactions on a dataset landing page in a variety of ways. And I agree, what we do, what we're interested in, what is possible might look very different in a few years. And if that's something that we always something that can be sort of built into the framework. I mean, web analytics don't care about downloads, so it's not part of these tools. You have to do it yourself, but we don't know where this is evolving. But yeah, that's sort of, I want to draw a line of what should be sort of version 1.0, which is sort of the basic features most people want. And then there's a long list of things that I'm sure we want to add later that, for example, includes things like download volume, geolocation, which is in a code of practice on a high level. So that's not person identifying, meaning by country. That's something that we can already do. So to see whether a data set is downloaded from particular geographic regions, that's built in, like any web analytics. So I think there's things we can do now, but I hope that there's more things to do in the coming years.
All right, thanks so much, Martin. Anyways, the chat can continue on that, and we will move forward here. So the next thing that we have is, just check in, the final recommendation. So after last meeting, we were able to start writing the final recommendation. It was posted in March through April. We only had one comment, but a lot of views. So we're going to use this as the final time to get any feedback from you all on things that you think should be changed before RDA endorses it. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so there's a link for this in the notes. Also, maybe Ian can put it into the chat if folks want to read it directly, and you can expand the screen and not see me, which might be easier. But this recommendation that we put out was based on the last work that we were doing, and Ian and Thomas, Juno, and I put this together. The beginning is really just a background on kind of what Ian said at the beginning of this session. And then if we go through the recommendations here, there's a couple of premises that we put. So the first premise is that data usage is something that we are interested in, but it's complicated and there's not a whole lot of activation energy. And so while this all needs to be resolved, we need to focus on minimal frameworks right now. A lot of this is to set up the premise that we couldn't actually even get anyone to work on the final recommendation with us. So it seems like we get folks to show up to each of these sessions. People are interested in talking about it, but people don't necessarily want to work on this. And that's what we found over the last 2 years. So we wanted to make sure that that was called out at the beginning, but also note that it's very important that we do find some solutions and not just discussion-based, but actual building solutions for counting. And so that's kind of what this first premise is about, kind of just setting it up, not putting forward anything more than saying we should start with basics. Going forward, there are a lot of complex issues, and we should have sub-communities that work on those issues specific to their domain or the types of data that they work with. I'm going to run through each premise, and then I'm going to stop sharing and we can discuss. The second premise is that the working group supports the Make Data Count recommendations of using the counter code of practice for research data and using open infrastructure for submitting this so that aggregations can be done. But this is really focused on ensuring that there is a way the community agrees upon counting. And so the code of practice can fluctuate, and that'll change as it gets versioned, like any counter document. But the group supports that there is a way for us to normalize our counting. The third premise is that we should be cautioned against defaulting to data metrics that are not created, like a data impact factor. And we feel that just defaulting to developed metrics not based on open data could be very harmful to this community, especially as we can't even figure out the basics of counting data usage right now. Premise 4 is that there's a lot of shortcomings and mitigations that can be made. We have to consider broader use cases for implementation. And so there's a lot of different things we need to consider, like data sets that don't have DOIs, reuse of data that doesn't have a download. So like in CCDC, how people use the models, data sets that have limited access, and other shortcomings thinking about the bibliometrics behind this. So this is to say, start with the basics, but there is a lot more that we need to consider and start building out for. And then the last premise is that the working group should continue to exist in maintenance mode or as an interest group, which we will discuss after this. Working closely in coordination with Scholix, as usage and citation are different, but closely tied together. And so that kind of plays off of the last question that we got about what about citations. We see these as different issues that come together for the same item, the data set, but this group needs to remain focused on usage counting because there is just a whole world of things that we have to consider for it, and we would rather leverage all the work that's happening within Scholix for citations. So I'm going to stop sharing and come back here, and let's see. I'm going to scroll first and see if there's any. Yeah, okay. So what we're hoping for is that Ian, Thomas, and I are here. We would love to hear anything that you think needs to be changed, any comments you didn't want to post publicly on the forum now that that's closed, or any thumbs up to parts because we really just want to get this formalized and done. So any thoughts, comments on that? Got an anonymous thumbs up. Let's see if there's a question. And people are feel free to unmute if you want to speak directly. We would love to have more people speak up.
Hi, Daniela. This is Gretchen. And congratulations and good work on getting the final recommendations completed. So it's a really nice summary. When there was mention on discussion of how social media could actually have influence on actual data usage or affect the accuracy of the measurement of data usage, have you considered, I know some metrics and some sites are actually trying to track social media mentions and things like that. Do you see that, like Citation, as being something totally decoupled or keeping that distinct?
I think people might have different ideas on this. I would say that it's related in the sense of metrics, but it may be different than data usage, which this group is focused on. Maybe Martin or Ian or Thomas, do you want to unmute and share?
Yeah, my first thought is around the difference between sort of citations in an article versus alt metrics, which is obviously where people started to track these things. And do we come down to that distinction between citation and usage that kind of Martin, I think, made a sort of pertinent comment to in the Q&A. And yeah, it all comes down to what are reliable measures of or proxies for usage, I think. And do I have an answer to the specific question asked? No, I don't think I do.
So I can add that I think social media metrics is an established metric for scholarly content. It's established that it's sort of widely used and we have sort of good understanding of many things. It measures something else than usage and something else than citation. So I see it as complementary. In the very first MDC project, unfortunately, we have reused the name a lot. We spent some time on surveying researchers of what kind of metrics they're interested in. There was clearly a preference for citations and social media metrics. And I have to say that was 2014. So things have changed, but it was just never a priority. And it's definitely something the MDC project is interested, but again, there's still so much work to do with citation and usage that this is sort of probably coming a little bit later. I don't know whether this.
I don't think anybody make that
counts doing this as a top priority. I'm sure this should be added at some point to complement, and it's probably social media metrics are more interesting in some kinds of data than in others. I mean, I have no idea what happens with anything related to COVID the last 12 months. I mean, there's so much attention on everything, research outputs in this direction. It would be super interesting, and I'm also pretty sure somebody has looked at this, so that would be helpful to see what you can learn there. And there's other sort of, let's say, highly contentious data sets, so everything related to climate research might also be true. So I can clearly see for some data it would be super useful, but I haven't looked into this. I'm not aware of any data, and it's clearly, as far as infrastructure goes, is something that probably happens at a slightly lower priority.
So, Danielle, can I weigh in? So hi, and I want to second what Gretchen said. I think the recommendations are great, and I'm sorry that you didn't feel that people were there working on them with the group enough, but I think we all understand that. Actually, I do think that maybe some of that could relate to the fact that for people in the trenches in any given domain, these feel really important, but also like that there's a gap, that they're pretty far away from things that we know how to grab onto and implement and use, and oddly enough, maybe fund, because I think that funders would be really interested in this concept of usage versus citation counts and things like that, and metrics that make sense. And so I wonder, I guess it comes to a question, how can any given domain jump in and work with you all? Is it, do we need a small pilot? How do we get it to resonate in the domain if lots of individual workers can't use it? Do we work with a repository that then can offer it as a useful service to people, as an incentive for them to put their data in the repository? Because look, you're going to actually learn something about how your data is used. Is it mature enough to make that kind of promise? That's sort of where my question lies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually what we were hoping to discuss about how the group should proceed. So maybe instead of answering it, I'm going to table that so that we can do the poll and then have that discussion, and then I'm going to call back on you about that. Any other thoughts, red flags, things that you would want addressed in this recommendation that we can still edit? I'll give it an awkward few seconds of silence until, and if we don't hear anything else, we're going to go forward. All right, well, email us if you feel like there's something you couldn't say out loud, or post on the recommendation when that time period was open. We want to make sure that we've captured all those thoughts in it, but otherwise we will move forward with that final recommendation then. So Ian, I'm going to pass it back to you to do our one poll question.
First thing I'll do is come off mute, and just bear with me while I go to the slide that I want to show. And then share that, because I'm sharing from the same thing that I'm looking at you all on. And make sure I get the right window. And I will put that in present mode. It's poll time. So I think the last session was Daniela's first attempt at using Mentimeter. And I think it was in education. This is my first attempt at using Mentimeter. So we'll see how we get on. But we do just have one question. And it really is just to gauge what the interest is of the wider community in sort of continuing discussions, work, activities around data usage metrics within RDA. The recommendation proposes that the group should continue, but I guess we want to get some form of validation of that. We could continue to sort of just meet periodically to have discussions about things. And I think I saw a comment in the chat about, putting it on slow burn. I think that's the equivalent on. But maybe there are specific topics that are out there where you think, no, come on, 18 months, you could sort of go away and focus on this, that, or the other. I say we as a community could go and do that. Or maybe we should just wind up and move on. So I see that there are people responding to the poll. So I think if I go to here and do present, we'll start to see the results coming in. And encouragingly, it's only one person thinks we should wind up and move on. And interestingly, 50-50 split sort of emerging here about convening, but also identifying something specific to focus on for the next 18 months, but over an 18-month period in sort of the spirit of an RDA working group. We'll just give it a little bit longer. We've had 29 people respond. Okay, seems to be reasonably static just at the moment. So that is a very interesting 50-50 split for me. I'm not sure I was anticipating that. I think the option of periodically convening to discuss developments is an easy one to sort of like take on and continue. So I mean, my sense is that we probably want to try and get from people a sense of what those specific things might be that an RDA activity could and should focus on in the next, going forward. So I will hand that back. Or at least stop screen sharing, and we can maybe start talking about that.
So it seems like we're getting some questions, some thoughts in chat. And if people want to unmute, let's just have a discussion aloud. And if people can help with the notes, I'm trying to do everything right now and I'm missing a lot. So if people can help on the collaborative notes document, that'd be super great to document all this. So I'm gonna mute and people take it away.
The sidebar that I think one of the main benefits of being able to continue to meet is to focus on guidelines and supporting implementation and adoption, and so providing a community or building up a community of people that's trying to adopt that, and then we can probably learn from those implementation experiences as well.
I would just echo that, and in fact, if folks are interested, this is potentially an area for a working group. But it would be great to collaborate and develop principles around the aggregation and display of some of these usage metrics. I know the effort that I work on, which is looking around usage metrics for OA publications and in particular books, I was struggling to do that same thing. So if others are interested in looking at that from the research data usage side, I know we're thinking about going forward with approaching NISO to work on a recommended practice. The one other area too that I would pitch, if folks are having issues with this around pulling together those usage metrics, and this came up in the data networks buff earlier today, but having a working group that's looking at how to create model language to facilitate the data transfer and use of these usage metrics. I know that's something we're looking at in our project for OA books, and I imagine it might relate here as well.
Do people have specific thoughts? So it sounds like the working group maintenance mode versus interest group is something that we can decide on. Does anyone have any thoughts on your experience with RDA and what you would prefer for this? It seems like we're kind of leaning towards this being in a more maintenance-y mode thing, but I don't think that that means we can't do specific things if folks like David and Christina and others want to take things forward. I think we're just trying to be practical here. Again, not trying to put the community on blast, but we have not gotten folks to help us out in this group. So Ian and I want to make sure that we go forward with something that is actually feasible.
So I was gonna put out that it sort of seems to me you could envision the next steps in two different tracks, maybe more. One being sort of the intellectual work of developing the way we measure usage and what it means and how it might be different in different domains. And then the other track would be just partnering with some places to do 2 or 3 specific implementations. So you get all that practical experience, you get those clear demonstrations that are in domains that you think where there might be some champions and at all different levels in the community to help sort of move things ahead. So.
Hey, Danielle and team, this is Adam. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes.
I mean, I'd love to advocate for another working group if possible, centered around adoption. I mean, our repository would love to be a part of that, and having a working group actually do work, like digging into interested repositories that want to adopt and what their challenges are. And it doesn't have to be, terribly taxing, but just having that committed time for a repository. Oh yeah, I've got a working group meeting this month. I need to, do my work. I think would just help. I think having those case studies of what it's like for other use cases other repositories to adopt would just help others sort of latch on to like repositories and help them grok what challenges they might face and how they can prepare to address them.
Thank you. And I think there's a
Yeah.
comment further up about the sort of data citation working group doing a great job focusing on implementation examples. So we can sort of perhaps think about sort of like that as a sort of model. And yeah, that's persisted over quite a period of time as, you know, people have come on stream at different times as well. And I think having those adoption stories helps raise that awareness when people see what can be done and that it can be done and what it says. Matt, you've come back online.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on how, so there are examples of adoption. We have a variety of repositories that have implemented the code of practice for research data, including Dryad, and all of the members of the Data One Federation are able to report because Data One reports on their behalf through the sort of shared services, and then Zenodo and some others. And so one thing we might do is to think about how maybe we could do a better job of surfacing those implementations that exist so that people know what the possible pathways are. You know, so there is the sort of independent implementation of a single repository and folding that in. I think Dryad and Zenodo are examples of that. There's sort of network approaches like Data One took, and then there's approaches like what Martin outlined, where, you know, somebody runs a hosted service for processing log data. And I think those different approaches have different strengths for the various groups, and we could probably do a better job of trying to show people what those are and how they can connect with them.
Okay, thank you for that.
I
And I
just
think
follow up to Matt, if that'd be all right.
yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, that'd be great, Matt. I'd love to see that stuff. You know, one of the things, at least for our repository, that doesn't quite resonate is just that, you know, we've got a number of tools reporting logs, and it's just unclear like how we would aggregate all that information. So we've gone a different approach outside of using our logs and using more event tracking. And so it's just the gap between like what we're doing and how we get back to counter code is, you know, just having someone there to, even if it's a half hour, you know, just to look through our use case and help us just make those fix my mental gaps, I guess, would be huge.
Yeah, so Adam, you know, we've had a lot of good experiences through the ESIP activity on developing schema.org stuff, and the Slack channel has been really useful to sort of connect people more in real time. I wonder if something like that would be helpful here as well, where, you know, if there's a forum where people can discuss implementation issues, it might engender more conversation.
Okay, thank you. We've had an interesting question in the Q&A, which is something, someone expressing, sorry, I can't actually read the names and the contrast here. I think it's Hans actually, who is supposed to make use of the download stats, and I think that's quite an important question as well. And that sort of relates a little bit to sort of like understanding the judgments they might have, no, not judgments, let's put it this way, understanding the questions they are trying to ask, and then understanding how download stats might help. If anyone has any thoughts on who the sort of primary users of download stats might be from their experience. Gretchen.
Hi, yeah, this is Gretchen, and I can say we're really starting to explore this in the download stats. I can speak from the astronomy community. Historically, download stats were really used heavily by the organization to understand throughputs. It actually fed back a lot into the infrastructure and monitoring of bandwidth for delivering data, how many distributed endpoints you needed to put in place to support those. So those download metrics, especially if you're going into bytes and measuring those level of details, are really helpful for organizations. So I just want to say that, and we're also starting to see that with NIST, that we're distributing a lot of data, but we're so it's really important to understand what are the most frequently accessed data sets. You know, what kind of throughputs are you getting on you know, across your entire repository, and that helps drive your system performance requirements and things like that. So that's just a little bit of feedback on how those usage metrics are really valuable.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that topic?
I just wanted
Christina?
to, yeah, I dropped this into the chat to the extent it's useful. So we have funding through the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to specifically look at the OA book usage data. And with that, we've actually been able to work with groups of stakeholders, from publishers to libraries to scholars, as well as those institutions, to define what their uses are, again, about books. However, I wonder how much of that, because much of that talked about impact and reporting to funders, et cetera. So it might be worth taking a glance at those to see how much of that maps over to the needs you have here around research data as a scholarly output. My brain, I'm trying to have this meta conversation around how much we're doing for OA books as a scholastic output, and the needs there map here to research data as an output, or some of the parallel conversations that are going on around journal article usage. So it's a big question.
It could be a good starting point to that discussion to look at the sort of kind of usages, but the other counter codes of practice, for example, that are put to there. And I think you've got this. It's not going to be as obvious, but I think you've got this sort of tracking from a individual data set through to something like a database. And these are each resources that people have different types of interest in, maybe. Am I investing as a funder in the infrastructure that allows you to make the data set available? Am I investing as a consumer of a service based around a data service or something like that? Martin, you've popped up.
Oh, I mean, that's exactly where I wanted to continue, and also on what Gretchen just said, that there's an interest in uses for specific data sets, and obviously finding out the interesting ones, but there is also the important use case of my repository as a whole is used so much, and sort of that justifies the funding we are getting or renewing. And I think that's a slightly different angle, but I have heard the latter, like I guess most on this in this call, a lot, that this is an important use case. Not that what's your 100 most valuable data sets, but just in general, the repository is used so much. And of course, it's kind of arbitrary whether 1 million downloads a month is good or 100 a month is good. But to have some that justify funding by the institution, the funder, whoever, that's a use case that's clearly there. And if this group can also help with that.
Track the usage, that it's again mostly about aggregations, and it's not
really, once you have the numbers for each data set, to add them up together and say in the month of October there were so many downloads and views, that's definitely, for me, is in scope of what this group tries to do.
Yeah, and I think the important word there from, I guess this from a CCDC perspective, is context of anything that you put out there, making sure it's clear that if data usage metrics tells you something, it's not likely to tell you the whole story. Paolo, I saw you pop up. I don't know if that was a mistake because you then went away very quickly, or if you thought that what you had to say, you changed your mind.
No, it's just that when I popped up, an echo started immediately because of the microphone, probably. So I switched it up. No, again, that's to continue on my previous question. I think data usage is about tracking usage of data, and the views and downloads are I don't think they are the usage of data, right? So they are just the tip of the iceberg. I know we have to start from somewhere, but I think we should immediately consider the idea that there are other kinds of events that we can track as easily as the views and the downloads, which are exactly the services that would come from the services that are using the data effectively. So when a scientist presses a button to process a data set, which fetches from a system, for example, these are the kind of usage events that may bring fortune, let's say, to this idea. And that's because tracking uses data, as you were mentioning right now, Martin, in fact, tracks at the same time the usage of other entities, for example, the service, right? So it's part of an ecosystem, the data usage tracking, that encompasses several actors. And so it's really hard to look at it from one single perspective. So I think whatever the framework we're going to develop is, we should take this into account. And among the use cases, we may, I think, easily have other kinds of events. We are in touch with research infrastructures most of the time, which have frequently use cases like this, right? And I think it would be great if we could have one at least use case that tracks this down. And these services would be interested because they need to report how much users use them, adopt them, right? The thematic services. And it would be an interesting experience, I think.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's maybe a bit that we have made an assumption on because we get different people showing up to every one of these meetings. So it might be worth mentioning things that were mentioned in maybe Helsinki meeting forward, which is that we are not saying that views and downloads are the data metrics. We are saying that we need a way to have comparable raw data so that bibliometricians can figure out what data metrics are. And so that's what the Make Data Count project has been focused on and why we exist. This working group was created because we wanted a way to be able to engage the community beyond just the initiative. And so I think what we're trying to say is we don't know what the metrics are. Agree, Paolo. There are tons of other indicators out there. We thought the lowest starting point would be how can we, we used to do a slide deck in this group where we would look at Zenodo, Dryad, Figshare, a couple of repositories, same domain, and say we can't even compare this right now. So the starting point was kind of lowest barrier. How can we start getting that? And that's where we kind of got tripped up to say, actually, it's not that easy. Views and downloads are not that simple. And so we're not to say that we don't want to look at all these other possible indicators. It's that we even wanted to get views and downloads to a state that Scholix got citations in, so bibliometricians can start working with this and we can move forward as a community. So this group was never intended to be the end-all data metrics, truly just one piece of the puzzle and working on that.
Thanks. See another question that appeared, which I don't propose we tackle because another recurring question, I think it is a recurring question, what is a data set? And yeah, I think that's in the context of hybrid repositories where, yeah, it's kind of, a lot of things get tagged as data because they're not articles. Click back to the chat. And a comment about was the name of the working group misleading, and maybe it's turned out to be that, and maybe we need to reflect on that as we go forward as to whether this is the right name to stick with or not.
I think it's a really good point, Hans. When we started this group in 2017 as a Birds of a Feather, we called it this. And then we, even as Make Data Count, started being like, we're not creating data metrics. We're just creating the infrastructure to even get to the point of having that. And so that is to say that there weren't initiatives working on this and the time has evolved. And so it's totally appropriate for us to look back and be like, we need to change the name of this. It's just that there was really nothing else to base this on and we're learning a lot as it's going.
I think one background question that's been going on, and I don't know how much we want to get into this now, but I guess it's, should this be an interest group? Should this be a working group in maintenance mode? Gretchen, putting you on the spot a little bit. I don't know if you want to just take a few minutes just to articulate the sort of RDA perspective on how these things sort of best work.
Well, I put a comment in the chat, and my apologies because I'm still fairly new to TAB, but this is really a community-driven organization, the RDA, and understanding the constraints of a working group. A working group, you have a very focused goal and output that you're trying to achieve. and it's a bit narrower in scope because at the end of 18 months you're kind of wrapping things up and producing something. Whereas an interest group, you know, you have objectives and you have goals that you're trying to achieve, and you're bringing together people around a common theme. But you do have a good bit of flexibility there. And if there's enough interest in the RDA community, you know, you have to go through the proposal process, you know, create your group charter, you know, outline your objectives, but it's, you know, it's definitely something, if there's a strong community interest, it's encouraged. So, and Rebecca shared the website link for information on groups, and there's also some work involved with improving the documentation there, but it's a pretty good compilation of what's involved with creating or maintaining groups. So I encourage people to read up on that.
Yeah. Okay, Rebecca, did you want to add to that?
Just a little bit. I think if you want to work within what RDA has set up, you're stretching the current definition of maintenance mode. And that's why I put that in there. It discusses what maintenance mode usually means. And what I love your idea of continuing. There's a lot of interest in this. A name change, but an interest group would allow you to continue to meet and get the support from RDA. So I think that would be, that's why I was suggesting an interest group. There aren't as many hoops to jump through.
Okay, thank you. Thomas?
Yes, I'll be really brief. I think that this subject is really huge, actually. And we see by the conversations here that there's a lot of interest in these topics, a lot of work to do. So I would just like to say that I would advocate for an interest group myself.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to briefly add from the energy and sort of the discussion we have in this call today, it doesn't feel like this should be the end of this group. And there's sort of multiple ways forward, and also what does it mean in detail, what an interest group or maintenance mode is. But just a general thought, this seems useful. There's still work to do, and I would, yeah, I think there's moving this forward makes sense just in terms of have we addressed what this group wanted to address? Is everybody bored and happy when we can finally finish in 15 minutes? And I think it feels more like there can be more, and what that exactly is also, I don't know, I'm co-chairing group in maintenance mode, with, as you of course are well aware, and it's not that there has to be a decision today or the next few days and that's sort of final, but that for me the most important feeling is, oh, there is interest in moving on, and the details can be determined I don't know, in the coming months, if you will, sort of well before the planning for the next plenary starts. And for me, for example, I don't know whether it's the next one or the one after. At some point, we will meet in person, and that gives, of course, very different opportunities for a working group or interest group, whatever it is then. So I would just feel like there's no need to sort of draw a line now unless people are exhausted, which is, of course, also possible.
Yeah, I think there's a point that we want to make sure we capture here, and I get the impression some people have said step forward and say, actually, there are aspects of this I am interested in, and I guess the ask here is that if you are interested in helping define the way forward, the things that we focus on going forward, please can you make your name known in the document, or seek other ways to us, because I think having that Scolex, just taking Scolex as the example, that continues well in maintenance mode, and there's a there's a moderate sized group of people who come together to sort of like keep things moving, and it takes more than just 2 people to do that, I think. And I'm really encouraged by the level of engagement that's been present in this conversation. It's been the highest that of all the sessions I've been to. Maybe I've just been to the wrong session so far. So really appreciate all the kind of comments coming in. And that's sort of, I think it's really an opportunity to sort of channel that in the best way within the RDA sort of infrastructure, because I think it's bringing together the right people for these conversations.
Ian, can you see? I keep pasting the listserv and it goes blank for me. Do you see an email, or does it not like email addresses?
It must not like email addresses, I guess, because yeah, it is blank.
Okay, I'm going to put it in the notes.
You can try missing out the @ sign.
For anyone who's interested, it's usagemetrics_working wg@rdagroups.org. It's in the notes. It's at the bottom. It is, if someone wants to spell it out, it's in the notes. But that's a listserv, Christina, that can be used between plenaries. It'll reach, I think there's maybe 300 people that are on the listserv that have joined over the years. So it sounds like going forward, Ian and I will export the chat, read everything, go through, decide, and then send an email to the listserv with our proposition for going forward. If anyone wants to work specifically with us, shout out to Thomas Juneau, who has always stepped up to help us. But if anyone else would like to step up, please reach out to us or put your name somewhere in this document so that we know. I'm also going to put in a plug here. So this group kind of started with information about the counter code of practice that was written in 2017-18. Counter, if you're familiar, does versioning of their codes of practice. It is now starting up a task force to think about the next version of the code of practice for research data. At the bottom of the notes on page 5, I've put in a call to action from Counter. If you would like to work with folks, some of us who are on the call, Martin Fenner, Matt Jones, myself, and others, please get in touch. And that would mean that you would be giving feedback on that version. There will be a public comment phase, and so we'll make sure that that in the fall gets through to everyone. But this is really, if you want to take a leadership role in the Code of Practice V2, then sign your name under the call to action with your email address or email me, and we can go from there. And Thomas, I see you are here.
Yeah, I was going to draft an application. Actually, I'm a member of the Counter Executive Committee, or at least until now, because I had to leave because of my shift in my personal responsibilities. But I would be definitely interested in participating in this task force.
Great, thank you, Thomas. Sorry for forgetting that you're on the executive committee. Any last comments from folks? It can be totally unrelated. It seems like we have a path forward. We got a lot of input today that was really helpful. Anything else, anything you'd like to plug that you're working on in the data usage space? Now's your time.
Or do you just want to play with the emojis?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of emojis.
If I may do a plug, 2 things that I know I'm going to be moving forward. One, if there are people interested in coming together to think about what principles should be behind the aggregation of usage statistics or the display of them in visualizations and dashboards, let me know, because I know some of us are thinking about going forward to NISO for recommended practice. In addition to that, if anyone does want to look at model data transfer and use agreements to help facilitate the exchange of this data between parties, again, please let me know, because I think that might be a working group that we're going to suggest to the RDA.
Okay. Any other plugs? Anything else? Okay. All right, then we can call it quits. And if you want to hang around, Dean and I will be here for the last 5 minutes. If you want to talk with us or continue chatting, we'll be here. But thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, just to add my thanks again. And thanks to Daniela, as I said.